My name is Meredith, and I am 34 years old. I stood in the doorway of my childhood home on December 23rd, watching my mother Patricia block the entrance with her arms crossed like a sentry guarding sacred ground. Behind her, I could see the Christmas tree glittering with ornaments I had helped buy over the years, and I could hear my siblings laughing with their children while the scent of my grandmother's famous cinnamon rolls drifted through the cold air. My hands trembled as I held a bag filled with carefully wrapped gifts, each one chosen with love and thoughtfulness. Patricia looked at me with an expression that held no warmth whatsoever and spoke words that would have shattered me just 1 year ago. "Christmas is only for parents now, Meredith. You wouldn't understand what that means." I simply smiled at her and said, "I understand perfectly, Mother." What nobody in that house knew was that my smile held 15 years of secrets that were about to unravel everything they thought they knew about me and about themselves. Before I begin this story, I would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, and let me connect with you. If stories about family drama, betrayal, and ultimate triumph speak to your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of resilience. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to a time when I still believed that being useful to my family meant being loved by them. I grew up as the middle child in a family where your position in the birth order determined everything about how you were treated and what was expected of you. My older sister, Denise, who is now 38 years old, was always the princess of the household, the one whose accomplishments were celebrated with fanfare and whose failures were excused with gentle understanding. My younger brother, Gregory, who is 30 years old now, was the golden boy who could do no wrong, the son my parents had desperately wanted after having 2 daughters, the heir apparent to everything my father Howard valued. And then there was me, Meredith, the responsible one, the peacemaker, the fixer who existed to smooth over conflicts and fill in the gaps that everyone else left behind. For as long as I can remember, I was the one who handled the practical matters that kept our family functioning. When Denise needed money for her wedding because she and her husband Franklin had overspent on frivolous things, I was the one who quietly covered the difference so our mother would not be embarrassed in front of her friends. When Gregory crashed his car for the second time and needed funds to replace it before our father found out, I was the one who emptied my savings account without hesitation. When my parents decided their kitchen needed renovating and discovered they were $5,000 short, I was the one who wrote the check and told them to consider it an early Christmas gift. I did all of this while building my career as a hospital administrator, a job that demanded 60 hours of my week and every ounce of my emotional energy, but I never complained because I believed that this was what family meant. My mother Patricia is 62 years old now, and she has always been obsessed with appearances and with grandchildren. In her world, a woman's worth is measured by the family she produces, and the more grandchildren you give her, the higher you rank in her estimation. My father Howard is 65, a quiet man who learned decades ago that it was easier to follow Patricia's lead than to challenge her on anything. Denise married Franklin right out of college and quickly produced 3 children who became the center of my mother's universe. Gregory married a woman named Bethany who understood exactly how to play the family game, and together they gave my parents 2 more grandchildren to dote upon. And I remained single, focused on my career, and secretly struggling with something that no one in my family knew about. What none of them understood was that I had spent years trying to have children of my own. I had endured round after round of fertility treatments, each failure cutting deeper than the last. I had sat alone in doctors' offices, receiving devastating news while my family assumed I was simply too career-focused to settle down. I had cried myself to sleep more nights than I could count, mourning the children I desperately wanted but could not seem to have. But I never told my family any of this because I had heard the way they spoke about women who struggled with fertility, the subtle judgment in their voices, the implication that there must be something wrong with you if your body would not cooperate with nature's most basic function. About 5 years ago, my mother started implementing new traditions around the holidays. Traditions that seemed specifically designed to remind me of my lesser status in the family hierarchy. She announced that Christmas Eve dinner would be reserved for parents and their children, a sacred time for the nuclear families to bond before the chaos of Christmas Day. At first, I was still included because, as my mother put it, I helped so much with the preparations that it would not be fair to exclude me entirely, but gradually, my role shifted from family member to unpaid servant. I was seated at the children's table because all the adult seats were needed for the parents. I was assigned cleanup duty while everyone else relaxed by the fire with glasses of expensive wine that I had purchased. I was asked to arrive early to help with decorations and stay late to restore order, but the actual celebration happened in moments when I was conveniently occupied elsewhere. Last year marked a turning point that I should have recognized as the warning sign it truly was. My mother called me in early December and explained that Christmas had become too hectic, too overwhelming, and that she needed to simplify things. She suggested that I come on December 26th, after the real celebration was over, to help with leftovers and to see the children open any presents that remained. She presented this as a favor she was doing me, sparing me the stress of the holiday rush, and I was so conditioned to accept whatever crumbs she offered that I agreed without protest. I spent Christmas Day alone in my apartment, eating takeout Chinese food and pretending that my heart was not breaking into 1,000 pieces. But the final straw came just 3 months ago, when I discovered through pure accident that I had been removed from the family group chat. I only found out because Denise accidentally mentioned a conversation that had happened there, and when I checked my phone, the chat no longer existed in my messages. I said nothing at the time, just smiled and nodded as though I had not noticed anything unusual. Then I saw the Instagram posts from the family's new tradition, a parents-only Christmas Eve dinner at an expensive restaurant that I had apparently not been invited to or even informed about. The photos showed my mother beaming with pride, surrounded by her real children and their spouses, while I scrolled through the images alone in my office during my lunch break. That was the moment when I finally added up all the money I had given my family over the years, all the loans that were never repaid, all the gifts that were expected rather than appreciated. The total came to over $50,000, an amount that represented years of my labor and sacrifice, given freely to people who did not even bother to include me in a group text message. I realized then that I had been paying for the privilege of being treated as less than, and I decided that this year would be different. I just did not know yet exactly what different would look like. What my family did not know, what I had deliberately hidden from every single one of them for 18 months, was that I had become a mother, not in the way my mother Patricia valued, not through pregnancy and biological connection, but through a process that had transformed my life more profoundly than I ever imagined possible. I had adopted twins, a beautiful boy named Lucas, and an equally beautiful girl named Emma, and they were now 2 years old and the absolute center of my entire universe. I kept my children a secret from my family, because I already knew exactly how they would react. I had not forgotten the conversation at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when my mother declared, in front of everyone, that adopted children were not really yours in the way that biological children were. She said it with such casual certainty, as though she were stating an obvious fact, rather than a devastating opinion, and no one at the table challenged her. I remembered how Gregory's wife, Bethany, had mocked a coworker who had recently adopted, calling her a pretend parent and suggesting that she was desperate for attention she could not earn through natural means. I watched my family nod along with these cruel assessments, and I knew in that moment that I could never share my own adoption journey with people who would view my children as somehow lesser, as second-best substitutes for the babies I could not produce myself. The decision to adopt came after years of heartbreak and failed medical interventions. I had spent tens of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments that left me physically exhausted and emotionally depleted. I had injected myself with hormones that turned me into a person I did not recognize, moody and bloated and desperately hopeful despite every reason to protect myself from that hope. I had lain on examination tables while doctors probed and measured, and ultimately delivered news that felt like a death sentence for the family I wanted so badly to create. And through all of it, I told no one in my biological family, because I knew they would offer judgment rather than support, advice rather than compassion. When I finally decided to explore adoption, I approached it with the same determination I brought to everything else in my life. I researched agencies and processes, attended information sessions, and began the lengthy journey of home studies and background checks and interviews designed to ensure I would be a suitable parent. The process was grueling in its own way, forcing me to examine every aspect of my life and justify my worthiness to raise a child, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, I was being asked to prove my love and commitment, rather than simply having those qualities assumed because of biology. I found Lucas and Emma through the foster care system, two siblings who had been removed from a dangerous situation and needed a home that would keep them together. They were 18 months old when I first met them, tiny and scared and clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. The social worker explained that separating them was not an option, that these two had been through too much already to lose the only constant they had ever known in each other. I looked at their faces and felt something shift inside me, a recognition that these were my children, even though they did not share my blood, a certainty that we belonged together in a way I could not explain. The adoption process took another 6 months to finalize, 6 months of visits and evaluations and court appearances that I navigated entirely on my own. Well, not entirely on my own. I had my best friend Caroline, who took time off work to accompany me to hearings and who stayed up late helping me baby-proof my apartment. I had my coworker Raymond, who served as a reference during the home study and who organized a secret baby shower at the office when the adoption was finally approved. And I had Dorothy, my 78-year-old neighbor who had no grandchildren of her own and who adopted Lucas and Emma into her heart from the moment she met them. These people became my family during a process my biological family knew nothing about. The irony of my situation was not lost on me as Christmas approached. My mother had declared that the holiday was only for parents now, and I was a parent. I had 2 children who called me Mama, who reached for me when they were scared, who fell asleep in my arms every night with complete trust that I would be there when they woke up. But I had kept them hidden because I feared my family's rejection more than I valued their inclusion. As the holiday drew closer and my exclusion became more explicit, I began to question whether I even wanted these people to know my children. Did Lucas and Emma need grandparents who would view them as counterfeit? Did they need aunts and uncles who would treat them as less than the cousins who shared family DNA? Or did they deserve better than what my family had to offer? The answer to that question would define the choices I made in the weeks that followed, choices that would ultimately expose every secret my family had been keeping, including their secrets about me. Thanksgiving dinner should have warned me about what was coming, but I was still too deep in my pattern of accommodation to recognize the signs. I arrived at my parents' house alone that day, having left Lucas and Emma in Caroline's care for the afternoon, and I came bearing gifts as always. I brought homemade dishes that had taken me hours to prepare, expensive bottles of wine that I knew my mother preferred, and carefully selected presents for each of my nieces and nephews. I walked through the door expecting the usual lukewarm reception, but I was not prepared for the level of dismissal that awaited me. My mother greeted Denise with an embrace that lasted at least 30 seconds, exclaiming over how wonderful she looked and how blessed they were to have her there. She welcomed Gregory with equal enthusiasm, pulling him close and telling him how much she had missed her baby boy. When I stepped forward for my turn, Patricia gave me a brief pat on the shoulder and immediately asked whether I had remembered to bring the serving platters she had requested. No hello, no expression of gladness at my presence, just a confirmation that I had fulfilled my assigned task. I told myself this was normal, that my mother was simply distracted by the demands of hosting, but something inside me recorded the slight and filed it away for future reference. The seating arrangement placed me between 2 high chairs, occupied by my youngest nieces, a positioning that was presented as practical but felt distinctly punitive. The adults sat at the main table engaging in conversation about their lives, their children's accomplishments, their plans for the future, while I cut food into tiny pieces and wiped sticky faces and retrieved dropped utensils from the floor. When I tried to join the conversation, my comments were either ignored entirely or addressed with brief, dismissive responses before the discussion continued without me. I was present in body but entirely absent from the family dynamic that mattered. The first direct attack came when Gregory pulled me aside during dessert, his expression suggesting that he had an urgent matter to discuss. He explained that he was facing some Christmas emergencies and needed $8,000 to address them properly. He did not specify what these emergencies were, did not offer any details about why such a substantial sum was necessary, simply stated his need, and waited for me to produce my checkbook as I always had before. For the first time in my memory, I hesitated instead of immediately agreeing, and I saw something flash across my brother's face that looked remarkably like anger. I told Gregory that I needed to think about it, that $8,000 was a significant amount, and I wanted to review my finances before committing. His response shocked me with its viciousness. He said that it was not like I had kids to spend money on, that my income was essentially disposable, since I had no real responsibilities, that I was being selfish when I had always been so generous before. The word selfish hit me like a physical blow, and I almost caved right there. Almost pulled out my phone to transfer the funds just to make the accusations stop. But something held me back, some new voice inside me that whispered I deserved better than this. And I told him no, not permanently, just for now, until I could assess my situation. Gregory stormed away without another word, and within the hour, I learned that he had reported to our mother that I was turning selfish. The second attack came during the dessert course, when Patricia rose to make an announcement about Christmas. She explained that this year's celebration would be restructured to focus on what truly mattered, the parents and grandchildren who made the holiday meaningful. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day would be reserved exclusively for those who had created the next generation of our family, a sacred time for traditions that only parents could fully appreciate. Then she looked directly at me and added that I, of course, understood why this made sense, that it was really about the children after all. Denise helpfully suggested that I could come on the 23rd to help with setup and preparation, and Bethany added with a barely concealed smirk that someone had to do the prep work if the real celebration was going to be special. I sat in stunned silence as my family casually erased me from the most important holiday of the year. I watched my nieces and nephews continue eating their pie, oblivious to the fact that their aunt had just been declared unwelcome at their Christmas. I saw my father stare at his plate, unwilling to meet my eyes, unwilling to challenge my mother's decree, even though something in his posture suggested he knew it was wrong. And I said nothing, just nodded as though I agreed that my exclusion made perfect sense, because fighting would have made a scene, and I had been trained since birth to avoid making scenes. The third attack came later that evening, when I was loading the dishwasher and overheard a conversation that was clearly not meant for my ears. My mother, my sister, and my sister-in-law had gathered in the adjacent sitting room, and their voices carried through the doorway with painful clarity. Patricia said I was almost 35 and still single, and she found it genuinely embarrassing when her friends asked about me. Denise responded that at least I was useful, that who else would fund all their activities if I suddenly disappeared. And Bethany delivered the final blow, saying that I should be grateful they included me at all, given my failure to accomplish anything meaningful with my life. I stood frozen with a dirty plate in my hand, listening to the three women who were supposed to love me describe me as an embarrassment, a wallet, and a failure. I wanted to storm into that room and demand to know how they could speak about me that way. I wanted to tell them about Lucas and Emma, about the beautiful family I had built without their help or their approval. I wanted to scream that I was worth more than the money I provided and the labor I performed, but I did none of those things. Instead, I finished loading the dishwasher, helped clean up the kitchen, and drove home alone in the dark, where I cried for 3 hours before falling into an exhausted sleep. When I woke the next morning, I knew that something had fundamentally changed inside me. I looked at photographs of Lucas and Emma, their sweet faces smiling at the camera, and I made a decision. This Christmas would be different. I would no longer beg for scraps of affection from people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of funds and labor. I would no longer hide my children from a family that did not deserve to know them. And I would no longer pretend that their treatment of me was acceptable just because they shared my blood. 2 weeks before Christmas, I received a phone call that changed everything. The name on my screen was Lorraine, my mother's younger sister, a woman I had always liked but rarely seen because she and Patricia had been estranged for as long as I could remember. Lorraine was 60 years old, divorced twice, and childless by circumstance rather than choice. In my family's hierarchy of values, these facts made her something of a pariah, the cautionary tale that mothers use to warn their daughters about the dangers of not following the expected path. But to me, Lorraine had always represented something different. The possibility that a woman could survive outside the family system and still find happiness. Lorraine's voice was warm when I answered, but there was an undertone of urgency that made me pay close attention. She said she had heard about what happened at Thanksgiving. That news traveled even to the family members who were supposed to be cut off from information, and that she knew everything about how I was being treated. I asked her how she could possibly know the details, and she laughed softly before explaining that she had maintained secret contact with our father Howard for years, that he called her when Patricia's behavior became too much for him to bear, and that he had told her about the Christmas exclusion with genuine distress in his voice. What Lorraine shared next felt like looking into a mirror that reflected a past I had never known existed. She told me that 30 years ago, she had been in exactly my position. She had been the unmarried sister, the one who could not have children despite desperately wanting them, the one who was expected to serve without ever being fully included. Patricia and their mother had excluded her from holiday gatherings using the same justification I was hearing now, that Christmas was for parents and she would not understand what that meant. They had treated her as hired help rather than family, accepting her contributions while dismissing her presence, until she finally realized that she deserved better and walked away. Lorraine told me about the years following her departure from the family, years that were difficult at first but ultimately liberating. She had built a life filled with friends who became closer than any blood relative, pursued interests that brought her genuine joy, and found peace in accepting that she could not force people to love her the way she needed to be loved. She had watched from a distance as Patricia repeated the same patterns with me, had hoped that somehow my generation would be different, and had finally decided to reach out when she learned about the Christmas situation. The conversation lasted for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from my childhood memories to my current circumstances. I found myself telling Lorraine about Lucas and Emma, the first time I had shared their existence with any blood relative, and her response brought tears to my eyes. She said they sounded absolutely wonderful and asked when she could meet them. She did not question whether they were really mine, did not suggest that adoption was a lesser form of parenthood, did not do any of the things I had feared from my family. She simply accepted that I was a mother and expressed joy at the news. Lorraine offered me something I had not realized I was missing: perspective from someone who had survived what I was going through. She told me that I did not owe my family my presence or my money, that their approval was not necessary for my happiness, and that my children deserved to be celebrated rather than hidden in shame. She invited me to join her for Christmas at her home, where she hosted an annual gathering of friends who had become her chosen family, and she promised that Lucas and Emma would be welcomed with open arms. I did not immediately accept her invitation, still caught between the pull of my biological family and the freedom that Lorraine represented. But something she said stayed with me long after we hung up. She said that sometimes the best revenge is living fully without the people who tried to diminish you. That the most powerful statement you can make is building a beautiful life they have no part in. I thought about those words constantly in the days that followed, weighing them against the hope that somehow my family might change, might finally see me clearly, might welcome my children if given the chance. The decision of where to spend Christmas remained unmade, but the seeds Lorraine had planted were already beginning to grow. On December 15th, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee and began the task I had been avoiding for years. I opened a spreadsheet and started documenting every dollar I had ever given to my family, every loan that was never repaid, every emergency I had funded without expectation of return. The process took most of the afternoon, requiring me to review old bank statements and credit card records and emails confirming transfers, and by the time I finished, I was staring at a number that made me physically nauseous: $87,000. That was the total amount I had given my family over the past 15 years, money that had disappeared into their lives without acknowledgement or appreciation. Gregory alone had received $52,000 for car replacements and house repairs, and vacations he claimed were necessary for his mental health. Denise had taken $30,000 for private school tuition for her children and to bail out Franklin's failed business venture. My parents had accepted $5,000 for their kitchen renovation, presenting it as a gift I was privileged to provide. Not a single dollar of any of this had ever been repaid, and most of it had never even been properly thanked. I was still processing this information when my phone rang on December 16th with Denise's name on the screen. Her voice was sweet at first, asking how I was doing, inquiring about my health and my job, performing the sisterly concern she had never genuinely felt. Then she got to the point. She needed $12,000 for a Christmas emergency, something unexpected that had come up and could not wait until after the holidays. I asked what kind of emergency required that much money, and she reluctantly explained that Franklin had lost his job 2 months ago and they had been struggling to keep up with their expenses. The private school tuition for her children was due on January 1st, and if they could not pay it, the kids would be expelled and humiliated in front of all their friends. I noticed that this was the first I was hearing about Franklin's job loss, that Denise had never mentioned it during any of our previous conversations, that she had hidden her family's financial struggles until she needed money from me. I thought about all the times she had bragged about their lifestyle, the expensive vacations they took while apparently being unable to pay their bills, the designer clothes her children wore while she was secretly drowning in debt. And I made a decision that shocked even me as the words left my mouth. I said no. Denise's reaction was immediate and explosive. She demanded to know what I meant by no, as if the word itself was foreign and required translation. She reminded me of everything she had done for me over the years, and when I asked her to specify exactly what that included, she spluttered before landing on the fact that they had included me in holidays and let me be around their children. I pointed out that including someone in holidays usually meant inviting them to the actual holiday, rather than asking them to prepare and clean up while being excluded from the celebration. Her voice turned cold in a way I had never heard before, and she called me jealous and bitter because I could not find a man or have children of my own. She said I was pathetic and only good for my wallet, and then she hung up before I could respond. The call from my mother came less than an hour later, and Patricia's tone made it clear whose side she had taken before she said a single word. She told me that Denise had called her in tears, devastated by my cruelty and selfishness, and that she was deeply disappointed in my behavior. I tried to explain my perspective, tried to point out the years of financial support I had provided without recognition, but Patricia was not interested in my side of the story. She cut me off and said that maybe it was best if I did not come for Christmas at all, that my presence would only create tension during what should be a joyful family time, and that she hoped I would use the holiday to reflect on my priorities. I agreed. That was the response that surprised her. The lack of begging or apologizing or promising to do better. I simply said that she was right, that I would not come for Christmas, and that I appreciated her making the decision so clear. There was a long pause on the line before Patricia said she had expected more of a fight, and I told her I was tired of fighting for people who did not want me. Then I hung up and sat in silence for a very long time, staring at pictures of Lucas and Emma on my wall, and I whispered to myself that I had my own family now. What I did not know until just before Christmas was that my exclusion from the family had been orchestrated by someone operating in the shadows, manipulating everyone's perceptions while appearing to be an innocent bystander. That someone was Bethany, Gregory's wife, and her campaign against me had been running for years before I ever suspected it existed. Caroline was the one who uncovered the truth. She had recently joined the same gym where Bethany worked out regularly, and she happened to be in the locker room one afternoon when Bethany was having an animated conversation with another woman. Caroline recognized Bethany from family photos I had shown her and decided to listen carefully, positioning herself where she could hear without being noticed. What she heard made her so angry that she recorded part of it on her phone, wanting to make sure she could share the exact words with me. Bethany was bragging to her friend about finally getting rid of me. She explained that she had been working for years to separate me from the family, using subtle manipulation to turn everyone against me. She told her friend that I was a threat because I was financially successful and independent, that my mother had always secretly admired me for building a career, and that Bethany needed to ensure that admiration never translated into any real power or inclusion for me. Her plan had been systematic and patient, executed in phases designed to isolate me completely. The first phase involved convincing my mother that I did not truly value family, that my career focus was evidence of selfishness rather than dedication. Bethany had dropped comments over the years about how rarely I visited, how I always seemed to prioritize work over family events, how I never seemed fully present even when I was physically there. She knew that Patricia's deepest fear was being abandoned by her children, and she exploited that fear by suggesting that I was already halfway out the door. The second phase involved reframing my financial contributions as obligations rather than gifts, convincing everyone that they were entitled to my money because I had no other use for it. Bethany had worked hard to ensure that no one ever thanked me properly for my generosity, that my contributions were accepted as dues I owed rather than sacrifices I made voluntarily. But the most devastating revelation came near the end of the recording. Bethany mentioned a text message, one that she had sent to Patricia 2 years ago but that appeared to come from me. She laughed as she described it, saying that she had used an old phone of mine that I had given to Gregory, one that still had my Apple ID associated with it, to send a message that was cruel and dismissive of Patricia's values and priorities. She did not share the exact content, but she made it clear that the message was designed to make Patricia believe I had contempt for her, that I looked down on her focus on grandchildren and family traditions, that I thought I was better than everyone because of my career success. This explained so much. 2 years ago, my mother's attitude toward me had shifted dramatically, and I had never understood why. She had become colder, more critical, more willing to exclude me from gatherings and conversations. I had racked my brain trying to identify what I had done to deserve this treatment, and the answer was that I had done nothing. Bethany had created a wound that I did not even know existed, had poisoned my mother against me with words I never spoke, and had watched from the sidelines as our relationship deteriorated. Caroline brought me the recording the day after she captured it, and we sat together in my living room while Lucas and Emma napped, listening to Bethany's voice describe her systematic destruction of my family relationships. I felt anger rising inside me, but I also felt something unexpected: clarity. I finally understood that I had not failed my family through some mysterious shortcoming I could not identify. I had been sabotaged by someone who saw me as competition and was willing to use any means necessary to eliminate me. The question now was what to do with this information. I could expose Bethany immediately, share the recording with my mother and siblings, and watch as her carefully constructed lies fell apart. But something held me back. Did I really want to fight for a place in a family that had accepted Bethany's narrative so readily? Did I want to force my way back into relationships with people who had never truly valued me in the first place? Or was this information better held in reserve, a trump card to be played only if absolutely necessary? I reached out to one more person before making my decision. Nathan was Gregory's college roommate, someone who had been close to our family for years before a falling out that Gregory never fully explained. I found his contact information through social media and sent him a message explaining who I was and asking if he would be willing to talk. His response came within minutes, and what he shared confirmed everything Bethany had bragged about in that locker room. Nathan told me that he and Gregory had stopped being friends because Nathan could no longer tolerate Gregory's attitude toward me. He said Gregory had referred to me as his ATM sister for years, joking with friends about how easy it was to extract money from me, bragging about the vacations and cars and lifestyle improvements my contributions had funded. Nathan had confronted Gregory about this behavior, had told him it was cruel to exploit a sister who obviously loved him, and Gregory had responded by cutting off the friendship entirely. Nathan offered to testify to any of this if I ever needed support, said he felt guilty for not reaching out to me sooner, and wished me well whatever I decided to do. I thanked Nathan for his honesty and ended the conversation with a clearer sense of my situation than I had ever possessed before. I had been used and manipulated and lied about for years, and the family I had sacrificed so much for had participated willingly in my degradation. Whatever happened at Christmas, whatever choices I made about confrontation or distance, I would make them with full knowledge of what I was dealing with. That knowledge felt like armor, and I needed armor for what was coming next. Christmas Eve arrived with a strange sense of calm that I had not expected. For years, this day had been filled with frantic activity, rushing to my parents' house to help with decorations and cooking and setup, exhausting myself in service of a celebration I would only partially witness. But this year, I woke up in my own home, in the bed where I slept next to my children's nursery, and I felt something close to peace. I spent the morning with Lucas and Emma, watching them play with the simple toys that brought them joy, reading them stories about winter and reindeer and magical nights. They were too young to fully understand Christmas, but they understood love and safety and the presence of their mother, and that was enough. We baked cookies together, or rather, I baked while they made messes with the flour, and laughed at the chaos they created. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely wonderful. Caroline arrived in the early afternoon with her arms full of groceries, ready to help me prepare a Christmas Eve dinner that would be small but full of meaning. Dorothy came over shortly after, carrying her famous apple pie and wearing a sweater decorated with embroidered snowflakes that she had made herself. And later in the day, Lorraine appeared at my door for the first time since she had reached out to me, her face lighting up with genuine delight when Lucas toddled toward her with his arms outstretched for a hug. We spent the afternoon and evening together, this group of women who had become my true family, cooking and talking and playing with the children who brought joy to all of us. Lorraine told stories about holidays from our family's past, memories from before the hierarchy had calcified, when Patricia and she had been close and the future had seemed full of possibility. Dorothy shared her own Christmas traditions, ones she had created with her late husband and continued to honor every year. Caroline talked about her hopes for the coming year, her plans and dreams, and the things she wanted to accomplish. And I felt included in a way I had never felt with my biological family, seen and valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. The contrast between my Christmas Eve and the one happening at my parents' house could not have been more stark. I tried not to think about it, but the images kept intruding. I imagined Patricia holding court at the head of the table, basking in the attention of her grandchildren, directing the festivities with the authority she so enjoyed. I imagined Denise and Gregory competing for their mother's approval, showing off their children's latest accomplishments, jockeying for position in the hierarchy that defined our family. I imagined Bethany sitting smugly in my absence, knowing that her years of manipulation had finally achieved their ultimate goal. And I imagined my father Howard sitting quietly in the corner, wondering where his middle daughter was, whether she was alone, whether he should have done more to prevent this outcome. That last image proved to be more accurate than I knew. At 7 o'clock in the evening, my doorbell rang, and when I opened it, I found Howard standing on my porch in the cold, his eyes red and his expression uncertain. He had never been to my home before, had never even asked for my address, and I later learned that Lorraine had given it to him when he called her in desperation that afternoon. He stood there looking at me with more vulnerability than I had ever seen from him, and he asked if he could come in. What happened next would stay with me for the rest of my life. Howard walked into my living room and saw Lucas and Emma for the first time, and he stopped in his tracks as if he had been struck by something invisible. These were his grandchildren, children he had not known existed until that moment, and the realization hit him with physical force. He lowered himself slowly to his knees, putting himself at their eye level, and when Lucas approached him with curious interest, Howard began to cry. He stayed for 2 hours, playing with the twins, meeting the women who had become my chosen family, and talking with me in the kitchen while the children were entertained elsewhere. He told me he was sorry, more sorry than words could express, for the years of passivity that had allowed my mother to push me out. He admitted that he had known the treatment was unfair, had seen how hard I worked and how little recognition I received, but he had been too afraid of Patricia's displeasure to speak up. He had been a coward, he said, and he hoped I could someday forgive him for that cowardice. He also told me that he had discovered something troubling about Bethany recently, hints that she had been manipulating family perceptions, but when he tried to share his concerns with Patricia, she refused to believe anything negative about her precious daughter-in-law. The text message I had allegedly sent 2 years ago had come up in their argument, and Howard had expressed doubt that I would ever say such things, but Patricia had dismissed his skepticism as evidence of his soft spot for me. The conversation had ended badly, and Howard had spent the past few weeks feeling helpless and frustrated. I told him about the recording, about the evidence that proved Bethany had orchestrated much of my exclusion. His face darkened with anger, the first time I had seen him express such an emotion in decades, and he asked what I planned to do with the information. I said I was not sure yet, that I had not decided whether I wanted to fight for a place in a family that had discarded me so readily. He nodded slowly and said he understood, and then he made me a promise. Whatever I decided, he would support me. He would not be silent any longer. Before he left, he asked to take photos with Lucas and Emma, pictures he intended to keep secret from Patricia until the right moment. He hugged me longer than he had hugged me since I was a child, and he whispered that he loved me, that he had always loved me, and that he was sorry he had let his love be buried under fear for so long. Then he drove back to the family celebration he had slipped away from, carrying with him the knowledge of grandchildren who deserved far better than the family they had been born adjacent to. Christmas morning began exactly as I had imagined it, with joy and warmth and the delighted squeals of 2-year-olds discovering presents under a tree. Lucas and Emma did not understand the significance of the day, but they understood that something special was happening, and their excitement was infectious. I watched them tear paper off packages with clumsy fingers, their faces lighting up at each new discovery, and I felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to my eyes. This was my family. This was my Christmas, and no one could take it from me. Caroline arrived mid-morning with coffee and pastries, and Dorothy followed shortly after with her traditional Christmas breakfast casserole. Lorraine called to wish us well and to confirm our plans for a late lunch at her house. The morning unfolded with warmth and laughter and the comfortable rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. It was, without question, the best Christmas morning of my entire life. And then, at 11 o'clock, my phone rang with my mother's name on the screen. Patricia's voice was ice when I answered, and her words were clipped and precise. She said that Howard had told her everything, that she knew about the children, that she could not believe I had hidden something so significant from my own mother. She demanded that I come to the house immediately to explain myself, to introduce these children she had apparently been denied, to account for my deception and my cruelty. The irony of her framing was staggering. I was the cruel one for protecting my children from her judgment, while she was the victim who had been denied her rightful access to grandchildren she would have dismissed as counterfeit. I surprised myself with my response. I said no, I would not come to explain myself, because I had nothing to explain. I said I was spending Christmas with my children, and that they did not need to be subjected to the chaos of a confrontation. Patricia's voice rose to a pitch I had rarely heard, and she practically screamed that those were not real children, that I had bought them because I could not have my own, and that I was embarrassing the entire family with this charade of motherhood. Something snapped inside me at that moment. Not with rage, exactly, but with clarity. I heard in her words the exact judgment I had feared, the precise rejection I had tried to protect Lucas and Emma from, and I realized that nothing I could do or say would change her perspective. She would never see my children as equal to her biological grandchildren. She would never accept that adoption was a valid path to parenthood. She would never acknowledge that I had built a beautiful family despite every obstacle she and life had placed in my way. And in that realization, I found a strange kind of freedom. I told Patricia that I would come to the house, but not to apologize. I would come to say goodbye, and before she could respond, I ended the call and began preparing myself and my children for the confrontation I knew was coming. Caroline offered to accompany me, and I gratefully accepted. We dressed Lucas and Emma in matching Christmas outfits, red velvet dresses, and tiny bow ties that made them look like the precious gifts they were. We loaded them into car seats and drove across town to the house where I had grown up, the house where I had once believed I belonged. When we pulled into the driveway, I could see the entire family watching through the window, their faces a mixture of shock and curiosity and, in Bethany's case, barely concealed alarm. Patricia met me at the door, her arms crossed in the same defensive posture she had used at Thanksgiving. But this time, I did not quail under her disapproval. I stood tall with my son on one hip and my daughter holding my hand, and I looked my mother directly in the eyes. The family gathered behind her. Denise, with her usual air of superiority, Gregory looking uncomfortable and uncertain, Bethany trying to make herself invisible, Howard standing at the back with an expression that might have been hope. The nieces and nephews crowded around, curious about these new children who had suddenly appeared in their family orbit, and for a moment, the scene was almost chaotic in its energy. I spoke before Patricia could attack again. I said that these were my children, Lucas and Emma, and that I had adopted them 18 months ago. I said that I had kept them secret because this family had made it abundantly clear that adopted children were considered lesser, that I had heard with my own ears how Patricia dismissed adoption as pretend parenthood, and that I had chosen to protect my children from that judgment. I said that I was not there to beg for inclusion, not there to apologize for my choices, not there to convince anyone of anything. I was there to say goodbye. The explosion that followed was everything I had expected and somehow still more. Patricia demanded to know how I could have hidden something so important, how I could have deprived her of grandchildren she had a right to know, Denise accused me of selfishness, of enjoying my secret while they struggled with the ordinary challenges of family life. Gregory asked whether I had money for lawyers and adoption fees, but not to help my own siblings, revealing once again that his primary interest in me had always been financial. Only Bethany stayed silent, her face pale, her eyes darting between me and Patricia, as if calculating her next move. I pulled out the spreadsheet I had prepared, the documentation of $87,000 I had given to this family over 15 years. I read the figures aloud, watching as expressions shifted from anger to discomfort to something approaching shame. I reminded them that I had never missed a birthday, a holiday, a crisis. I had been there every time they needed money, every time they needed labor, every time they needed someone to do the work they did not want to do themselves. And in return, they had erased me from Christmas. What happened next changed everything. I turned to Bethany, who was still trying to remain invisible in the corner of the room, and I asked her to tell everyone about the text message. Her face went completely white, and she stammered that she did not know what I was talking about. So I pulled out my phone and played the recording Caroline had captured in the gym locker room, the one where Bethany bragged about forging a cruel message in my name. The room fell silent as Bethany's voice filled the space, describing in detail how she had used an old phone of mine to send a message that made Patricia believe I held her in contempt. I watched my mother's face as understanding dawned, as she realized that the text which had poisoned her against me for 2 years had never come from me at all. I watched Gregory turn on his wife with an expression of betrayal, demanding to know whether the things Bethany had told him about my supposed comments were also fabricated. I watched Dennis's smugness crumble as she realized how thoroughly she had been manipulated into treating her own sister as an enemy. Nathan stepped forward then, having arrived with Caroline as planned. He confirmed everything I had suspected, telling the gathered family about Gregory's years of referring to me as his ATM sister, about the casual cruelty with which my brother discussed exploiting my generosity. Gregory tried to deny it, but Nathan had messages, screenshots, proof that my own brother had viewed me as nothing more than a convenient source of funds to be drained. Howard moved to stand beside me, physically positioning himself as my ally for the first time in my life. He said that he had watched Patricia destroy their daughter for decades and that he was done being silent about it. He said that he had met Lucas and Emma the night before, that they were beautiful and wonderful and absolutely his grandchildren, and that if this family could not accept them, then he was finished pretending that everything was fine. Patricia broke down then, sobbing with a mixture of guilt and anger and confusion that she could not seem to untangle. She tried to explain herself, tried to say that she had not meant to hurt me, that she had only wanted what was best for the grandchildren, but her words fell flat against the evidence of years of exclusion and dismissal. The grandchildren she had prioritized were confused and upset, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with their family Christmas, but not understanding what or why. I felt no triumph in watching my family implode. I felt no satisfaction in Patricia's tears or Bethany's exposure or Gregory's humiliation. I felt only a profound sense of peace, the quiet certainty that I had finally spoken my truth and that I could move forward without the weight of their approval on my shoulders. I gathered my children, thanked Caroline for her support, and prepared to leave. Before I walked out the door, I said one final thing. I told them that I had not come for an apology, and I was not expecting one. I had come to show my children the house where I grew up, to let them see where their mother came from, and to close a chapter that had needed closing for a very long time. Then I left, and I did not look back. The weeks after Christmas brought changes I had not anticipated. Gregory and Bethany separated after her manipulation was fully exposed, and she moved across the country to live with her mother. Denise reached out with a letter of apology that seemed genuine, acknowledging her years of taking advantage and offering to repay the loans I had given her, even if it took decades. Howard began visiting me every week, building a relationship with his grandchildren that was tentative but growing. And Patricia, after a period of silence, finally entered therapy for the first time in her life, forced to confront patterns of behavior that had damaged every relationship she valued. The reconciliation, if you could call it that, was slow and conditional. I set clear boundaries about what I would and would not accept, making it clear that Lucas and Emma would only be around people who treated them with the same love and respect afforded to the other grandchildren. Denise earned her way back into my life through consistent effort and genuine change. Gregory was slower to come around, but eventually he sent a short message, acknowledging his wrongs and asking for the chance to do better. Patricia remained a work in progress, sometimes falling back into old patterns, sometimes showing glimpses of the mother I had always wanted her to be. But the real healing happened in the family I had chosen for myself. Lorraine became an honorary grandmother to the twins, showering them with love and wisdom from her years of living outside the family system. Dorothy remained a constant presence, her warmth and kindness providing stability that Lucas and Emma thrived on. Caroline was promoted to godmother, a title she accepted with tears in her eyes and a promise to always be there when needed. And I learned, finally, that my worth was not determined by the people who had tried to diminish me. 1 year later, at Lucas and Emma's 3rd birthday party, I looked around my living room at the people who had gathered to celebrate. Lorraine was there, and Dorothy, and Caroline, and Raymond from work who had helped me through the adoption. Denise had come with her children, Franklin notably absent after their divorce. Howard sat in the corner with Emma on his lap, reading her a story with more patience than I had ever seen from him. And Patricia was there too, quiet and watchful, still earning the trust she had spent so many years squandering. It was not the family I had been born into. It was not the family I had spent years trying to prove myself worthy of joining. It was something better, a family built on choice and love and the recognition that we all deserved to take up space in each other's lives. The pain of what had happened would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into wisdom, into boundaries, into the fierce determination to give my children something better than what I had experienced. That Christmas, when my family told me I was not welcome because I was not a parent, they thought they were excluding me from something precious. They did not realize that they were setting me free to find something more precious than anything they could offer. They did not know that my smile, the one I gave my mother as she stood blocking the doorway, was the smile of someone who had already found her way home. If you are watching this and feeling invisible to the people who should love you most, I want you to know that your worth is not determined by their blindness. Sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is permission to walk away from the table where you were never truly welcome. Build your own table, fill it with people who see you, and never, ever apologize for taking up space in your own life. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between the family you were born into and the family you built for yourself? Have you experienced the pain of being excluded by people who should have embraced you? Drop your story in the comments below and let us support each other through these difficult experiences. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to help others find it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of resilience and triumph over family betrayal. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone in their struggle for acceptance and love. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community we are building together. I wish you the courage to stand up for yourself, the wisdom to recognize your own worth, and the peace that comes from being surrounded by people who truly love you. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.